What the government has available to spend is comprised of what it can raise as taxes and what it can borrow. So there are always limits to what it can raise as taxes. And again, there's a very interesting South African story about that, because we were able to increase the tax yield without increasing tax rates, because we focused on how to build an efficient tax administration. And the other side of it is of course, debt. And debt is a complex issue, and I think the panelists will deal with the operations of the bond market. I was not an operator myself, but I was kept abreast of developments as Minister of Finance. We had an auction every Tuesday, and all that I would need to know is what the tenor of debt would be at the Tuesday auction and later where it's settled. So I'm saying that you can't discuss debt without also looking at what government spends, what it spends resources on, and what that spending does to improve on the quality of life of people. Yesterday there were reports of 2 billion rand of corruption at Tembisa Hospital. That's part of the expenditure side. It's done nothing positive to improve the quality of life of people, but it's part of the expenditure side. And to finance that 2 billion rand, it would have come out of taxes and or debt. And so if you don't have a public finance view and you don't have treasury control, then these become entirely academic arguments. It's quite important to ask the questions in the context of our constitution about what we do to improve on the quality of life of people and what happens in respect of the resources that are put together either as taxes or as debt, and how. He says, I'm not an economist, but the way in which I'm looking at this, that money's already spent. And so this is interest paid on money that's already been spent. And so you're spending more on yesterday than what you are on tomorrow. It's fundamentally important that we bring the issue back and understand that if we want a future, then education needs to be our primary expenditure. There's a basic logic about the arguments of Madiba on the issue of debt. There's a graphic, perhaps Tabisa will share it later. They couldn't get it on the screen, but it's a cartoon of me as a young finance minister saying debt sucks. And it does suck. It absorbs everything you do. And so it's quite important that you understand the nature of the quicksand and what you must avoid in dealing with issues of debt. I did a very simple linear exam in 2008-9, the period when I was last finance minister. Debt service costs were 54.3 billion rand. 54.3 billion rand. That was 2.4% of GDP and 8.95% of total budget expenditure. The numbers from this year's budget review, just compare the 54.3 to the present, it's 424.9 billion rand. It's now 5.9% of GDP and 16.25% of budget expenditure. And we'll show a picture in a moment. But that shift from 2.4 to 5.9%, let's assume, but it was catalyst, that shift of debt is that 90% of our debt is domestic debt. 90% of our debt is domestic debt, and that makes such a significant difference. Now, part of the work that I was doing in this year, certainly, was trying to understand the picture of debt on the African continent. And in the recent past, we've had three African countries default. Zambia, Malawi, and Ghana. Ethiopia's got its own set of problems, and there's a major issue. What happens is that countries then seek to negotiate their way out of a default. And while the negotiations happen for a period of 3 years or so, they can't borrow. They can't borrow into real. It's a big issue. The other issue is that if you looked at the period between 2017 and 2023, because countries borrow abroad and there are exchange rate and interest rate fluctuations as they go. Most African countries have had increases of almost 12% per annum in their debt service costs because they borrow from it. And when that happens, you can understand what will happen and why defaults follow. And more than half of African countries now spend more on debt service costs than they do on education, health, and protection against climate change. So it's a deep, deep issue. I'm saying it's not just a numbers issue. It goes to the heart of politics. It goes to the heart of the ability of countries to afford to improve the quality of life of their citizens. So that's the big issue. The penultimate point I want to make is that societies need a way of knowing what's going on. And accountability is a fundamentally important part of this. Now, one of the things we do, and I discovered not so long ago, that South Africa is one of the few countries that actually publishes its debt stats. And you can go to the budget review, it's produced on the budget day.
Welcome to me. And Dean of Research in Economics and Management Faculty and an NRFY. And I am Thabiso Malefe. I'm the current treasurer of the UWC Young Investor Society. I'm a student. Marie, I'd like to pose the first question to you. So when we talk about economic debt, how does a firm like Coronation look at that?
When we at Coronation think about public debt, so government debt in particular, it impacts on our investment decisions and the way we think about quite a range of variables. So the first thing to say is high levels of debt in a government, just like a household, crowd out your options. They increase your financial fragility, and they tend to make the country grow slower. So we look at it from a growth perspective. And what you see is that high levels of debt tend to raise long-term interest costs. It makes the government, forces the government to redirect revenue into servicing that debt, the chart that Trevor put up earlier, and that tends to lower growth. It has a knock-on effect to confidence, right? Because when you look at high levels of debt, it creates insecurity and it limits your ability to grow. And so when you make investment decisions, your ability to monetize and profit from those long-term investment decisions become much more uncertain. An unsustainable debt position as a position where debt continues to accrue and accumulate relative to your economic resources. We put this against GDP, but if you are a household and you are taking on more and more debt, at some point you're going to be unable to service that debt, and the same applies to a country. So while Trevor was absolutely right, we have the benefit in South Africa of domestically funded and that we borrow in domestic currency. 90% is actually more local currency denominated debt. At some point, that debt stock still becomes unsustainable. Your ability to continue servicing it, and almost 20% of the revenue collected is then much more precarious. And crises happen slowly at first and then very quickly towards the end. So we do think about sustainability and debate this rigorously in terms of the calculus around the debt drivers. So what is happening with growth? What is happening with the existing debt stock? How committed is government to consolidation, and how those dynamics play out in the trajectory of debt? So these are issues that impact very much on our investment decisions, on the way the portfolios are constructed, especially with a very long-term investment horizon.
Thank you for that answer. And now I'd like to pass the next question on to Prof. Swanepoel. I would like you to just speak to us on how does government debt or public debt just impact everyday South Africans? Because we know with public debt, we might say, oh, government's borrowing more, but then how does it actually affect the everyday consumer or the everyday household?
Okay, thank you. So there's a joke that I always like to start with. If you ask 10 economists the same questions, you'll get 11 different answers. So, because economists always think in terms of it depends. It depends on what you're going to look at, and it depends on who's going to make the decision and what decision they're going to make. So if we look at debt and South African households specifically, we have to look at the interest rate payments that they will have to take on, and Mr. Manuel also mentioned with fluctuating interest rate that becomes unpredictable, and then tax. So there's actually, maybe we'll get back to that later, but eventually if debt becomes unsustainable, tax is one of the key parts that governments has to push up more in order to get some income to service that debt and to pay for that interest on the debt. And as we've discussed now a bit, as you pay more and as you have to service your debt more, it leaves less room for your social spending. So Mr. Manuel mentioned education, health, infrastructure, all of that gets crowded out, as Marie also said. Then we also have to consider inflation and the cost of living. So if debt becomes unsustainable and becomes more, it erodes living standards and inflation drives up. Because one of the reactions that we haven't had in South Africa, but that we've seen elsewhere in the world, is the printing press. That the central bank tends to then start printing money just to keep up with rising debt costs, and that's usually the start of the end, if I can call it that way. And then also exchange rates. So South Africa is a small open economy, as I'm sure you all know. We are subject to world changes, and we rely on world prices. And as debt grows, the rand might depreciate. Our imports that are often our expensive goods become more expensive, and our exports deteriorate. And then we also have the social trade-offs that I've mentioned before. Reduced wages in the future, especially for public workers, cutbacks in subsidies, and new taxes. So I think I'll leave it there, and then we'll continue the discussion.
The next question, I'd like us to have an understanding of where this debt came from and how we look at it now. So I know that from 1994, it was government debt to GDP was just shy of 50%. Going from 1994 of that to 2008, like Mr. Manuel pointed out, we had a lower government debt to GDP ratio of around just under 10%, if not even flat. So 26. Sorry about that. 26. Could you explain to us how if you look back as an economic historian, was the way that South Africa handled decreasing the debt by that much sustainable, or was it done in a more hectic way, as you can see what Argentina is doing currently?
Yes, exactly. No. So I think Mr. Manuel should answer that question, but I do think it was actually sustainable. And what happened, so he mentioned the weather forecast about storms coming. If it wasn't for international events, and again it comes back to us being that small open economy, I think we could have continued to grow. And because what we tend to forget is during that time where we see that decline in GDP debt ratios, we had 3% growth rates. We had a 10 percentage points lower unemployment rate than we do have now. And that was what allowed us to decrease that debt ratio and to ensure we've got something in the coffers for when the problems came, because as a small open economy, you have to prepare for when those storms come. And that storm came in form of the Great Financial Recession. And I think we don't talk enough about, so Mr. Manuel also mentioned it, but the Great Financial Recession and the change in government spending habits happened at the same time, and we're still trying to recover from that. And I think what you mentioned that's stuck with me from the keynote is in 1997, it was an active decision that was made to make these good fiscal and monetary decisions. And we need to get back to that point where we need to make the tough fiscal decisions and stick to them, because otherwise it's just going to keep going up and not actually change. It's that whole idea of doing the same thing and expecting different results. If we don't actually make those tough decisions, it's not going to improve quickly.
Thank
Can I
you.
just add something? Sorry. Just to make the point that there was a definite watershed around 2008, but then within the next sort of 4 years, there were also some decisions that were made domestically that contributed to that accumulation of debt. And the first thing that happened in 2008 domestically was we ran out of electricity. So we were able to capitalize on that beautiful period of growth when that Christy mentioned, where growth was 3%. In fact, we had 2 years of growth, real growth over 5%, right? Headed into that GFC. It was fueled by the opening up of this economy, by a huge amount of investment in economic and trading services that had not been pushed out into a lot of the country beforehand. We had a massive benefit from terms of trade, which was a tailwind to revenue generating parts of the economy, particularly in the primary and secondary sectors, that were an enormous tailwind to our being able to generate those primary surpluses. And while there was spending happening on CapEx at the time, we were not investing in that, in particular, in the productivity, or sorry, the capacity around ESCO. And so where those industries were competitive internationally because we had very cheap and reliable electricity for a long period of time, all of a sudden that faltered. So we had actually some quite specific domestic drivers that then undermined the growth rate through that whole period. And while we had built up these fiscal buffers, which were fantastic and had been a very disciplined implementation and policy decision by the government at the time, meant that we then made expenditure allocations over the medium term predicated on a return to growth that never came. And so all of a sudden the composition of that expenditure changed enormously, and it went from being a little bit more balanced, a little bit more conservative, and a little bit more consolidatory to using deficit-funded revenues to spend largely on recurrent expenditure. So into salaries, into wages, into goods, into procurement, and away from CapEx. And I think the combination of those factors has had a material impact on that increase in the debt service cost that was demanded.
Thank you for that. And my next question will be directed to you, Sherry. So you spoke about how there were so many factors involved in that. How does coordination or firms that you worked at during the period of 2010 up until we can even say post-COVID pandemic, what are the factors that you guys looked at in terms of our debt that you guys would say, hey, this is being unsustainable? Or how do you guys look at the rise in debt when it comes to your investment decisions?
All right, so the first is that we take quite a granular look at the revenue and expenditure breakdown of the budget. You know, we have this medium-term expenditure framework, which is a fantastic framework that allows you to update on a regular basis the long-term planning around both what you're expecting to receive in revenue, what you are committing to in terms of expenditure. And as Mr. Manuel said, we have National Treasury produces in Excel a fantastic amount of data. In fact, I think they're trying to kill us with it. There is so much information, you can bear yourself on that website for ages, but they really do. The pivot tables around the budget are fantastic. You can analyze it every which way, and we take it down to a fairly granular level. So we look at, and it predates the pandemic, although the pandemic was an extremely challenging time just because we didn't actually know what those numbers were going to look like in the end, and I think it was an exercise in creativity that pulled us along. That just really taught us a lot about budgeting and the complexity of it. But we then, predating the pandemic, in fact actually from probably about 2010, it became necessary to look at the budget in a very granular level, particularly expenditure related to the compensation, right, which continued to grow at very strong, real inflation-adjusted rates. The rise of debt service costs, which even though we have this domestically denominated termed out, we have a very long average term to maturity of our debt, which makes the repayment much easier than if you have foreign denominated debt where you could be called on it and you have to actually have the dollars or the pounds or the euros to repay it. Those are all fantastic buffers to being able to service the debt. The reality is that the yield curve steepened enormously, and so the market started to question fiscal sustainability, and that term premium grew hugely in terms of bonds. So the marginal rate at which we borrowed increased. And then we would look very carefully at what are the allocations that can be consolidated. So what are you spending on grants? What are you spending on salaries? Where are the areas of reasonable consolidation and will they be met? And then we look at all the growth drivers. So if you think about the calculus of debt accumulation, the rate at which you accumulate debt is a function of your existing stock of debt. How much you are paying to service that debt relative to what you generate in revenues, relative to your growth rate, and then the discretionary aspects of your budgeting process, which is your primary balance. Are you choosing to spend less than you are generating in revenue and to build those buffers, the primary surpluses that we alluded to during that beautiful low point in the debt service cycle? And all of those dynamics have become increasingly adverse in South Africa.
What is your outlook on the debt trajectory of South Africa, and how can we look to better it, or how can we look at servicing that debt at a sustainable rate?
I think that's the difficult question, and I think it comes back to making those decisions and sticking to the decisions, because I think what we also saw from that graph is it's got a long tail. So even if we make these decisions now, it's going to take maybe another 10 years to really feel those effects and to see those, maybe the debt servicing costs to come down and to change those dynamics. And I think that's the sad side, is that as long as it takes to get to these levels, it takes maybe twice as long to bring them back down again, especially without consistent decision making and financial prudence. And then the other thing is we just need to grow the economy. So I think that's what Marie was saying as well, is I get frustrated, and those formative years when we saw that decline in debt service cost was my formative years as a student and as a high school student. And so that's where I come from, when you could see the benefit of growing at 3%, the benefit of growing at 5%. So when I was doing my master's at Stellenbosch University, my development economics professor taught us the rule of 72. So I don't know, I see Paulo there at the back, but I don't know if any other of you took my 232 macroeconomics course or 152 macroeconomics. Not with me. But so the rule of 72 is you take 72 and divide it by your growth rate, and that is roughly how long it will take for your living standards to double. So if we are growing, I'm going to do quick math here, if we're growing at 3%, it will roughly take 20 years for living standards to double. Sure. If we're growing at 6%, it will roughly take 12 years to double living standards. If we're growing at less than 1%, it takes more than 70 years. So that's how economic growth can accumulate and make a very big difference very quickly to public finances. And then I'm also starting to say we need the job creation, and I know everyone says that, but we need to increase our tax base because we are starting to run, and we see this with the debate around income tax and VAT. VAT we saw earlier this year, they wanted to increase VAT again. How much resistance there is to more tax increases. And I think it comes back to people are not feeling in their real lives the impact of the taxes that they pay. And people are getting sick and tired of it. And that comes back to stopping the leaking of through corruption, making sure we spend that this expenditure actually impacts people's daily life. So I think I'll just leave it there and we can see more.
Thank you.
One of the points I didn't mention, but is quite important in the context of debt, is the role of ratings agencies. It's a massive, massive, massive issue. We started without an investment grade rating. By about 98, 99, be broken through and had an investment grade rating. The interest rates came down as a consequence. And by about 2012, 2014, we dropped back into sub-investment grade. And so the cost of borrowing is so much more now. It's something that, because you've got an outside judgment, however that judgment works, it's there and it has an impact on how much you can borrow therefore. The other point I wanted to raise is part of the modernization. In the early period of democracy, all of the borrowing for government was done by the Reserve Bank. We had to free the Reserve Bank of that responsibility and set up smart operations in Treasury. It was an important part of modernization. And we allowed the Reserve Bank then to take a single responsibility. Monetary policy, and the anchor for that is an inflation target. It's an important part of the general discussion about economic policy. The last point I wanted to make, apropos Marie's point about electricity, in the decisions were taken on Medupe and Kusile. It was going to be the last coal-fired power stations of significance in the world. And because of that climb up in the period of state capture, just yesterday, Kusile handed over 800 megawatts. It's something that should have happened like 16 years ago. We didn't have the electricity, and we were paying debt on a power station that wasn't delivering. These things all work together.